The world of road racing has seen its fair share of talented riders, but none quite like Dan Kneen. With multiple Manx Grand Prix wins, Ulster Grand Prix trophies, and standout performances at the Isle of Man TT, he was a real influential figure in the racing world. But on May 30th, just days before the TT races during practice sessions, something unexpected happened. Join us as we go through the life of Dan Kneen and try to uncover the details of that tragic day. Daniel Richard Kneen, aka Dan Kneen, was born on June 26, 1987 in Douglas on Isle of Man and grew up in the nearby village of Onchan. From the moment he was born, motorcycles were already a huge part of his life. The Isle of Man itself is one of the most famous places in the world for motorcycle racing, and the legendary Isle of Man TT had been a part of the island's culture for more than a century. So it was almost impossible for Dan to not be influenced by the roar of racing motorcycles. He later said in an interview that watching the TT series as a child was one of the things that inspired him to become a racer himself. Moreover, racing was deeply rooted in his family, as he was the son of Richard Kneen, a racer who had competed at both the TT and the Manx Grand Prix, finishing runner-up in the 1982 Newcomers Senior Manx Grand Prix and recording a 27th place finish in the 1986 TT production class alongside legends like Joey Dunlop. Plus, his uncles also competed, which meant that conversations about motorcycles and racing were a normal part of life in the Kneen household, before Dan was old enough to have any say in the matter. So given this profound racing background and upbringing, it was natural that Dan started riding at just 4 years old, where he often used to practice in fields around the island. Like many other racers, he started on small bikes, and as he grew older, his natural ability on motorcycles became obvious. The Isle of Man TT has a strong grassroots racing culture, where young riders, including Dan, had to start competing in the local events before moving to larger competitions. Dan took racing seriously as a teenager, competing in local events and building his experience steadily through short-circuit racing before finding his way to road racing. People who watched him couldn't help but notice how smooth and controlled his style was, like he was a natural on motorcycles. His breakthrough came in 2008 when he entered the Manx Grand Prix, which was one of the most important stepping stones for riders hoping to compete at the prestigious Isle of Man TT. And Dan dominated the races, where at just 21 years old he made history by winning the Newcomers C race, the junior class, and ultra lightweight race, which no other rider had ever achieved in the history of Manx Grand Prix before. It announced him to the wider world as not just Richard Kneen's son following in his father's footsteps, but as Dan Kneen, a rider who was going to carve out his own name entirely. The following year in 2009, he made his TT debut and delivered several strong finishes against some of the most experienced road racers in the world, and around the same time, he finished 4th overall in the British Superstock Championship. Despite his success in closed circuits, Dan's first love was always road racing. Over the years, he won multiple Irish races, such as Cookstown 100, and even achieved victory at the Ulster Grand Prix. In fact, at Ulster GP, even after breaking his foot earlier in the event, Dan snatched the Superbike win by just 0.001 seconds over Dean Harrison, which was the closest finish ever recorded at the Dundroyd circuit. Apart from races, Dan was known for his humble and friendly personality. In fact, some of the fellow riders and teammates often described him as one of the most approachable people in the paddock. By 2018, Dan had firmly established himself as one of the island's most respected road racers. The stage was set for what many believed would be the best year of his career. But sadly, fate had some other plans. On May 29, 2018, the practice week for the Isle of Man TT started as usual, with the race days scheduled for June 2nd, 4th, 7th, and 8th. The Snaefell Mountain course is unlike any other racing circuit in the world, with 37.73 miles of public road that circles the northern half of the island, starting at the grandstand on Douglas's seafront, running north through Selby and up the Snaefell Mountain hairpin before completing a clockwise loop back to where it started. As for 30-year-old Dan, the evening was one of the best of his career. While riding his Tyco BMW S1000RR during Superbike qualifying, he posted a lap of 132.258 miles an hour, which even surpassed his previous fastest lap of 130.347 miles an hour from the 2017 Superstock TT. It put him third in the qualifying session and placed him firmly among the contenders for race week. Everything seemed to be falling into place, and his goal of achieving his career best season seemed within his reach. But sadly, Dan couldn't have foreseen the tragedy that would unfold just a day later. May 30th started like any other day during TZ practice week, and Dan continued preparing inside the Tyco BMW garage. He was known for his thoughtful and disciplined nature, who preferred to build speed gradually rather than rushing into things without any plans. People who knew him in the paddock, as well as teammates who had watched him work, believed Dan was entering the 2018 TT in strong form, with a real chance of fighting for the podium finishes or even a victory. That being said, as he departed from the TT grandstand alongside teammate Michael Dunlop to start his practice lap, something unexpected happened. The incident started at around 6:30 p.m., approximately 22 miles into the first lap, when Dan reached the Churchtown section of the course. It's a fast left-hand sweeper following the straight post K tree marker where riders usually hit the speed ranging between 170 to 180 miles an hour. It's well known that Churchtown isn't considered one of the more treacherous sections of the course in the way that certain corners on the mountain are, but the TT mountain course doesn't really have safe sections when you're riding a 1-liter superbike close to its limits. At the speeds these machines travel, every yard of tarmac demands everything a rider has, and the margin between a clean lap and a catastrophe is measured in fractions of a second and millimeters of lean angle. At that point, Dan was leading on the road by about half a second over Dean Harrison, who was riding number 5 motorcycle. According to Harrison, Dan entered the corner slightly wide or near the left verger of the usual racing line. And because of this wider entry combined with the camber or slight tilt of the road, it forced Dan's bike into a sharper lean angle than normal. During that split second, the front tire of his motorcycle suddenly washed out, which snapped his BMW to the left side uncontrollably. The bike then slid at high speed for several yards before crashing into the roadside hedges and trees. Within seconds, his machine burst into flames as it struck the foliage, whereas Dan was thrown clear of the disintegrating bike and landed separately in the oncoming lane, where he ended up sustaining catastrophic injuries. Debris from the crash hit Harrison as he came through moments later. He estimated they had been traveling at somewhere between 160 and 180 miles per hour at that point on the course. Track marshals, upon seeing the smoke, immediately rushed to the scene, where they saw Dan lying in an unconscious state. Realizing the gravity of the situation, race officials raised the red flags at around 6:31 p.m. local time, and the entire practice session came to an immediate halt. Within the next few minutes, medical staff reached the scene and started administering CPR before moving to advanced life support procedures in order to stabilize his condition. However, the severity of Dan's injuries were just too much, and even after the countless efforts by the medical team to revive him, he showed signs of irreversible damage. And just like that, minutes after the crash, Dan was pronounced dead on the site at the age of 30. Tragically, the day didn't just end there. What happened next added another layer of tragedy to an already devastating evening. As riders were being instructed to return to the grandstand by traveling the wrong way around the mountain course, which in itself was a risky protocol, another tragedy took place. Approximately 10 to 15 minutes after the crash, an ACU-driven course car, which was carrying officers, was heading toward the scene at Ballasire, near Bollow. In that moment, the car collided head-on with a rider named Steve Mercer, who was returning to the grandstand. The impact was severe, where he sustained multiple injuries, including a fractured leg and damage to his vertebrae. Steve was immediately airlifted to the Nobles Hospital on the Isle of Man, and then further transferred to the Royal Liverpool Hospital for surgery. And though he survived the crash by a stroke of luck, he ended up receiving life-changing injuries. A few days after Dan's death, pathologist Dr. Irvin Long confirmed that Dan had suffered multiple unsurvivable trauma, which he received after a 150+ mile-an-hour impact. The inquest into Dan Kneen's death was opened at Douglas Courthouse and eventually concluded in February of 2019. The BMW telemetry data revealed Dan's speed into that section was slightly higher than on his previous laps. Marshals stationed in the area, including Flag Marshal Vanessa McHugh and her partner Deputy Sector Marshal Craig McHugh, both noticed that his bike seemed positioned slightly further to the left-hand side of the road than the other riders coming through. It was not dramatically wrong, but we have to understand that on a public road at those speeds, slightly wrong is all it takes. Further data showed that Dan had braked slightly later and entered Churchtown at a marginally higher speed than he had during an earlier practice lap that week. Plus, the suspension and lean angle stayed normal until the front tire suddenly lost grip from a small drop in wheel pressure. This could be because of him entering a turn a bit too fast, which made the tire slip out suddenly like a car hydroplaning. The simplest way to understand what happened is to think about a car correcting too fast on a wet road. Even a perfectly good tire will still slide if you ask more of it than conditions allow. And at 170 miles an hour, that margin between what is possible and what isn't is measured in fractions that no rider can see coming. In the end, the coroner, John Needham, said it was not entirely conclusive why the front wheel broke away, and that he was not in a position to reach a conclusion of rider error. He recorded a verdict of death by misadventure, meaning a tragic accident during a high-risk sport with no outside interference involved. And then on June 15th, Dan's funeral was held at Douglas Crematorium, where a large number of friends, fans, and members of the riding community came together to pay their respects and say their final goodbyes. After the tragedy, when the news reached the world, a moment of silence was held around the mountain course during the next TT race to honor Dan. Ryan Kneen, his brother, went out on Thursday's qualifying session wearing one of Dan's square helmets and completed a tribute lap of the mountain course in his brother's honor. Meanwhile, Tyco BMW chose to continue competing at the 2018 Isle of Man TT, where they achieved massive victories with Michael Dunlop, who dedicated his performance to Dan. Looking back, one would say Dan's passing left a deep mark on the world of road racing. For many fans on the Isle of Man, he represented the dream of every young rider growing up on that island. A local boy who once stood on the roadside watching the TT and who eventually became one of its stars. Even after his passing, Dan Kneen's legacy continues to live on through the memories of his races, his achievements, and the inspiration he gave to young riders. And perhaps the most perfect way to remember Dan is through the words he once shared. Racing at the TT is something every Manx kid dreams about. To be able to ride here in front of your home crowd, there's nothing else like it. Rest in peace, Dan Kneen.